Well, welcome back. Our third lesson is going to be on the properly basic belief that God is who is ultimately real, that He is the source of all reality and everything that is, and that He stands in a category of reality by Himself is one of the fundamental things that the Bible teaches us about God. Uh, we go to Genesis 1:1 and look at that passage together. We find that the Bible doesn't begin with an introduction or an explanation to us about where God came from. It does give an explanation of where everything else came from, but in fact, the first issue the Bible uh, addresses is where do we come from? But it doesn't say anything at all about where God came from. In doing what it does in Genesis 1, it does not tell where God began or where God came from or how God came to be. We can wonder about these issues all we want, and no person will ever solve them in the text of the Bible. You'll find that there's no place in the Bible that it tells us this is where God came from. The Bible begins with the words, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." That verse introduces us immediately to the main character of the Bible. And the main character of the Bible is God. It does so in such a way that it expresses the assumption that God has always been there. The existence of God is not an idea that's proven in the scriptures. The Bible doesn't address the origin of God anywhere. It just states it to be true that God is. The text goes back to that point where time began, the beginning, and states that before the beginning ever came to be, God was. Therefore, as one begins to examine the basics of a biblical worldview, as we examine the basics of God's point of view on this world as He's given to us in His Word, as we do that by examining the beginning of the Bible, we have to take some time to think about a philosophical question. And that philosophical question is this: what is an assumption or a presupposition? Because what Moses does as he writes Genesis 1:1 is he presupposes, he assumes that everybody agrees to the idea that God has always been before there ever was anything. So we're going to take some time to look at the ideas of assumption and presupposition and look at maybe a phrase that helps us understand what's going on here a little bit better, called properly basic belief. The dictionary gives the following definition of the word assumption: an assuming, that which is assumed, a taking upon oneself, a taking for granted. It defines a presupposition in this way: that which is presupposed or taken for granted. Now, both of those notions fall short in explaining the philosophical and theological foundation to Genesis 1. And I believe that there is actually a better term to use. Though it is longer, it is more accurate. And that term is a properly basic belief. Now, to understand this, I'm going to take you to a book that was written by a man by the name of Kelly James Clark. It's a short book, but it's a good book. And what he explains in there is that every person has a system of beliefs to which they hold. Every one of us has one. Every person in the whole world has this system of beliefs to which they hold. And if that person examines those beliefs, they will find that all of their beliefs fall into one of two categories. Those categories are things one believes without the support of other beliefs, and those things that one believes because other things one believes supports those beliefs. Now, the first category of beliefs is called basic beliefs. Okay? As we just think about this, how does the Bible begin? It begins with no explanation of where God comes from. It tells where everything else came from. And the existence of God is not a postulate that is proven in the scriptures. It's just stated or assumed that He is. Okay, we sometimes call those assumptions presuppositions. Every person has a system of beliefs then that they hold to be true. All their beliefs fall into these two categories: basic beliefs and non-basic beliefs. Basic beliefs are things that are believed because we believe them, because we trust that they are true. Non-basic beliefs are believed because of the basic beliefs that we hold. Basic beliefs then have two characteristics. They're held to be true, but cannot be proved to be true, and they are accepted by faith. Properly basic beliefs, then, are beliefs over which no other beliefs take precedent. Properly basic beliefs are those beliefs that are at the bedrock of what we believe. When we put together all the properly basic beliefs that a person holds, we get what is known as a worldview. Let me give you an example that I found helpful. This comes from Clark's book, and he's illustrating for us in this example the difference between a basic belief and a non-basic belief. And he's going to use mathematics to help us with this. He said this: I believe, for example, that 2 + 2 = 4 without the evidential support of any other beliefs. The belief that 2 + 2 = 4 is basic for me. Although the belief that 2 + 2 = 4 is basic for me, the belief that 572 + 382 = 954 is not. I believe the latter because I believe that 2 + 2 = 4, and that 8 + 7 = 15, and that 5 + 3 = 8, among other beliefs that are involved. We look at that, what he's saying here is that 2 + 2 = 4 is a basic belief. It's something that's foundational to the understanding of mathematics. But that 572 + 382 is not so. That it is believed as an extension of, and it's built on other beliefs, and it's built on beliefs that are basic beliefs. Okay? Basic beliefs then have those characteristics. They're ideas one holds to be true but cannot prove to be true. They're understandings that a person accepts by faith. We accept that 2 + 2 = 4 by faith. Every worldview has ideas and understandings in it that are accepted by faith. We call them properly basic beliefs. Some people call them ultimate presuppositions. They are beliefs then that take precedent over other beliefs and serve as criteria for other beliefs. They are beliefs over which other beliefs take precedent. And a sum total of all of one's properly basic beliefs about how reality is put together is what we call a worldview. There are some foundational, properly basic beliefs that the Bible teaches. And the first one is this: that God existed before anything else. That idea that God existed before anything else is an ultimate presupposition, or a properly basic belief that the Bible presupposes. Doesn't try to prove it, it just states it. An examination of some key biblical texts reveals this to be true. Okay? We've already looked at Genesis 1, and what we find there is that God existed before anything else that existed. God is the answer then to the question, what is really real? Behind all of the reality that we know is the person of God. He is the one who holds it all together. He is the one who is ultimately really real. A couple other places in the Bible that we can see this taught are these: Job 38-39, Colossians 1:16 and 17. So let's just think about Job for a moment. In the book of Job, in the first 2 chapters, we are told about a scene that takes place in heaven as Satan comes before God to give him a report. And in that event, as he's reporting to God, God asks him if he's noticed Job, if he's noticed how blameless this man is. And basically, Satan says, why wouldn't he be blameless? You protected. And if you weren't protecting him and I could do what I wanted to do to him, then he wouldn't be blameless anymore. And God lets him test Job. We look at the rest of Job chapter 1, and as we work our way down through there, we find that everything is taken away from Job, all of his wealth, his children. At the end of the chapter, he has nothing except a wife who's complaining that he has nothing. And he arises, it says in verse 27, and he said, naked I came from my mother's womb, naked I shall return. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. And the author of Job says, in all this, Job did not sin or charge God with wrong. So Satan comes back again in chapter 2, and God has the same question for him. And Satan says, a man will give up anything as long as he has his health, as long as he's not suffering physically. He can live in poverty. I've learned that. Okay, let me take away his health, and he will curse you to his face, to your face. And God gives him permission. Gives Satan permission to, as he says, stretch out your hand and touch his bone and flesh. And he will curse you to your face. That's what Satan said to him. And the Lord said to Satan, behold, he is in your hand, only spare his life. Satan has permission to torture Job as much as he possibly can without taking his life. And we find that Job becomes miserable. At the end of the chapter, he is sitting on a pile of ashes, scraping the boils that have come up on the surface of his body with a broken piece of pottery. And he has his wife looking at him and questioning him and saying, do you still hold fast to your integrity? Do you still think that there is a good God out there? Curse God and die. That's what his wife is saying to him. But he said this to her, you speak as one of the foolish women would speak. Shall we receive good from God and shall we not receive evil? And in all of this, Job did not sin with his lips. What we have in the book of Job recorded for us then is a conversation after that introduction between Job and some friends who have come to comfort him in his sorrow and his grief. And from chapter 3 through chapter 37, there's this conversation, a going back and forth between those who were his comforters. It tells us that they came and they sat for a week silent, and they comforted him more with their silence than they did with their words. And as we come to the end of the book, though, throughout the book, you've noticed that Job has been asking God to speak, and Job has been asking God to speak to the situation. You come to Job 38 and 39, the Lord brings a storm, and out of the storm, God speaks. He asks questions that point out clearly that God was there before anything else was here, and that he is the creator of all that is. And he asks some questions like this. Where were you when I laid the earth's foundation? 38:4. Who determines its measurements? 38:5. Have you commanded the morning since your days began and caused the dawn to know its place? 38:12. All of those questions imply that the one who is asking the questions of Job is the creator who brought all of reality into being. He asks some other questions. Questions like this. Do you know when the mountain goats give birth? That's 39:1. Or is the wild ox willing to serve you? In 39:9. Is it at your command that the eagle mounts up and takes his nest on high? 39:27. All of these questions imply that the one who's asking the question is also the one who is currently holding everything in place. What he's saying with those questions is, I was there before there was anything, and there wouldn't be anything if I didn't hold it all together right now. Now, what is said through questions in Job 38 and 39 also shows up in the New Testament. We go to the book of Colossians. We find this passage that Paul writes to the people at Colossae. And speaking of Christ, he says, starting in verse 15, and he is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. For by him all things were created, in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities. All things were created through him and for him, and he is before all things, and in him all things hold together. That's a summary of the questions that Job asked, or that God asked Job in Job 38 and 39. What we find both in Old Testament and New Testament then, in places like Genesis 1 or Job 38 and 39 or Colossians 1, is that the Bible teaches us that before anything else existed, God was there. Now, there are some implications that we need to think about from this belief. First one is this: God is before everything else. God, who is before everything else, is before everything else is brought into existence. Therefore, he alone is really real. He is the ultimate source of all that is real. That's what those passages are claiming. That's what they're teaching us. They're also telling us that God has authority over everyone and everything because he created it all. Now, Satan would like you not to believe that. Actually, Satan would like you to believe that he is an independent God on equal basis with him and that they are at war. Yet, when we go to chapter 1 and chapter 2 of Job, we find that Satan is one of his angels. He is a fallen angel, but he's one of his angels who's called to account by God, who has to ask God for permission to do what he does, that God limits him. God has authority over everyone and everything because he created it all. You have to remember that. Third, another implication is this: that a creator God who desires to be known by his creatures would create a being with the capacity to know and relate to him and then reveal himself to those creatures is logically coherent. That's exactly what you would expect a God who wanted to have a relationship with the creature that he had created to do. He gives them the capacity that they can talk to him, that they can communicate to him, and he reveals himself to them, and they understand the revelation, and there is an ongoing conversation that begins. It's logically coherent for him to do that. True understanding of who God is revealed in his word. We have to turn to God's word to understand who God is. One of the things that God's word teaches us then is that there are really two levels of reality, two categories, if you will. It kind of works like this. We put a line across there to divide our two levels of reality. We have an uncreated reality. There's a reality that was not created, and that reality is eternal. That reality is unchanging. That reality is independent. It's original, and it contains only the triune God. That's what the Bible teaches us. It teaches us that before all that was created, God was there, that he was eternal, that he's unchanging, that he's independent, that he's original. It also teaches us then that there is true reality that is created reality. Okay? We are not just the dreams of God, as Hinduism might tell us, or we're not little pieces of God that have been broken off and are scattered throughout this world. We are real beings created by a real God. But we live in a created reality where God is eternal, we're temporal. We are bound by time. Time is one of the contexts in which we always live, and it's never a context in which God lives. We are constantly changing. God never changes. We see that change on a day-by-day basis in our lives. We see that change as we look at how we mature and grow, and as we watch children change and grow and develop and become adults, but we also see it as we as adults begin to diminish in capacity and ability and skills. We see it as our hair grows gray and some of it falls out. We see it as we become more feeble and have less strength to do what we'd like to do. We are changeable. This whole world is constantly changing. But God doesn't. We're dependent. God is independent. There's nobody outside of himself that he depends on for his existence. But each of us are dependent. We're dependent upon God to give us the very breath that we breathe. It's interesting that in the book of Daniel, as Daniel confronts Belshazzar, as he's telling him the writing on the wall, he gives him a little sermon about things he should have learned from Nebuchadnezzar. And one of the things that he says is, you have offended the very God who holds your breath in his hands. His point to Belshazzar is, the very breath that you breathe comes to you from God. It's a gift of his grace to you. Every atheist in the world, even though he cries against God using the breath that God supplies. We're derivative. God's original. We're derivative. We're derived from we're derived from things. We are brought together, it tells us in Genesis 2, from the dust of the earth, and God breathes into us and we become alive. We are made in God's image. And it's interesting, as we look at the scriptures, we find that we as people, as mankind, are the only thing made in God's image. We are the image bearers of God. We are derived from him. The model for us is him. There are no heavenly elephants to serve as a model for earthly elephants. But there is a heavenly model for what it means to be a human being. And what it means to be a human being is connected to who God is. And one of the ways that we can know who we are supposed to be as people is to study who God is. So in this created reality, it includes absolutely everything that God has created. Two different levels of reality are taught to us in the scriptures. And those two different levels of reality have two different things that occupy them. One of them has only triune God. The other one includes everything else that is. One reality, that of God, is eternal, unchanging, independent, original. The word we use for that is he is holy. He's completely different than we are. Created reality is temporal. It's bound by time. It's bound by place. It's bound by space. It's changing. It's dependent. It's derivative. And it is constantly pressing at the boundaries that God has created for it to live within. The Bible teaches that. That's just the basic thing that it teaches, and we need to understand as we think about who God is. Now, the question that we have, as creatures created with the capacity to know God, as creatures who have revelation from God in such a way that we can know him, the question is, what does God claim to be in the scriptures? Okay? But before we talk about that, I want us to think for a moment about what it means for God to show himself through natural revelation. See, God has created us with the capacity to know him, and he's revealed to himself in such a way that people can know him. And because that's so, it leaves us as people with the moral responsibility to pursue knowing him. That's what is behind Paul's statement in Romans 1:20 when he writes this. For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world in the things that have been made, so that they are without excuse. This knowing of God does not leave people free to build their understanding of who he is in any old way their intellectual imaginations might take them. We are bound by God's self-revelation of himself to us. Because this is so, the important question is the one on the screen. What does God say about himself? Who does God claim to be in the scripture? Now, there are many passages that could be used to answer those questions. I'm just going to take some time to look at three key passages. One of them is Exodus 3 and 4. That's the passage of the burning bush, where God shows himself to Moses and tells Moses to go back and lead the people of Israel out of Egypt. Exodus 20. We know that is the Ten Commandments. It is an event in which God reveals himself in a profound way to the whole nation of Israel as he comes down in a cloud of glory on the Mount Sinai and causes it to quake and to shake and creates great fear among the people of Israel. And all 2 million of them hear God speak. They hear him speak 10 words. We hear him speak his law to them. And they cower in fear. And they ask God to let Moses represent them. The third passage is John 1. In the introduction to his gospel, John gives a preface, and in that preface, he deals with this issue of who does God claim to be in the scriptures. So we're just going to quickly just think through those passages together and to see what it says about God. Exodus 3 and 4 shows us that God reveals himself to people. Moses was just going along in the wilderness, doing his job. He was taking care of his father-in-law's sheep. He was conducting the family business. And he looked over on a mountain and there was a bush that was burning, and that didn't seem so odd until he noticed that the bush never quit burning. And it didn't seem to be being consumed. So he went over to see what was going on. And as we look at Exodus chapter 3, we find that when he comes to the bush, he hears a voice. Okay? God reveals himself to people. He revealed himself to Moses. Moses did not initiate this burning bush. He didn't go looking for God. God came looking for him. And he reveals himself to him. And he talks to him. And he speaks to him. And the first thing he tells them is, take off your shoes because you're standing on holy ground. This is sanctified, holy ground. This is a unique place. This is a meeting place of the image of God with God himself. In chapter 3, in verse 8 of that chapter, he tells them that he is the one who is going to deliver Israel from the Egyptians. God is the deliverer. In chapter 3 and verse 14, Moses asks a really good logical question of God. God has given him his assignment, and he has laid before Moses what he wants them to do. And Moses says, well, wait a minute. When I go back there and I tell them that God sent me to take you out of here, they're going to ask some questions. Verse 13, he says this, then Moses said to God, if I come to the people of Israel and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they ask me, what is his name? What shall I say to them? And in answering the question, what God says about himself is that he is eternal. And that's reflected in the very name that Moses is to give to the people of Israel. It says in God's, verse 14, and God said to Moses, I am who I am. Who is God? He is. He always is. Okay? Past, present, future matter to us because we are time bound. Past, present, and future doesn't matter to God because he is not bound by time. He just always is. He says, I am who I am. And he said to Moses, say to the people of Israel, I am has sent me to you. The eternal existing one who always is, for whom the present or the past is present and the future is present, is. He's eternal. What he says there also is that he is the reason for his own existence, that there is nobody outside of him who brought him to be. Verses 15 through 17, he says, God is the promise keeper. Goes ahead in that passage, he says, God also said to Moses, say to the people of Israel, the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, has sent me to you. This is my name forever, and thus I am to be remembered throughout all generations. He reminds them that he was Abraham's God, that he was Isaac's God, that he was Jacob's God, and that he made promises to them, and he will keep them. He's the Almighty God. In verse 19, it says, I'm going to send you to Pharaoh, and I'm going to send you with this message. And then he says this, revealing both his power and his omniscience. But I know that the king of Egypt will not let you go unless compelled by a mighty hand. And he's saying to Moses, I am the mighty hand who is going to compel him to push you out of the land. He's involved in the affairs of this earth. Okay? He is involved in the affairs of Israel as they prepare to come out of Egypt and come into the promised land. He's not bound by the laws that govern the physical world. When we go back and we look at what God did to impress Pharaoh with who he was, we see him bringing plague after plague after plague upon the people of Egypt. And he makes a dividing line between the Hebrews and the Egyptians. And that dividing line keeps those plagues from affecting the Jews, even while they are devastating the Egyptians. And what we find is that there are no boundaries or laws governing the physical world that bind God. He can work past them. We call that miracles. And ultimately, by power, God released the people of Israel from Egypt by breaking the rules of how this world works in doing things that show the magnificence and the wonder of his power. In Exodus 20, God tells us in Exodus 20, verse 1, first of all, that he's a person. He's a person who's making a covenant with the people of Israel. It says, and God spoke all these words, saying, I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. I am the Lord your God. It says, and God spoke all these words, saying, it's a person who's talking. He's a communicator. He's able to speak to them and reveal himself to them, and they are able to understand. He is the deliverer. He is the one who's going to bring them out. Actually, here he's going past tense, and he says, you are now standing outside of Egypt before the base of Sinai, and I'm the one who brought you here. I'm the one who's delivered you. It's interesting. He's not saying, as he gives them the law that he's going to give them, he's going to give them rules for how delivered people are supposed to live. He's not saying, do these rules and I will deliver you. He's saying, now that I've delivered you, here's what you are to do. This is how you are to live, to reflect that I have graciously brought about your salvation. Same thing happens to us as we work with the New Testament. He has priority over all creation. Verse 3, first commandment, you shall have no other gods before me. What God is saying there is, I come first. I matter most. He's impossible to capture perfectly in one image. Verse 4, in fact, he says, don't even try, people. You shall not make for yourself a carved image or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them, or serve them. For I am the Lord your God. For I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children to the third and fourth generation of those who hate me, but showing steadfast love to thousands of those who love me and keep my commandments. We never know everything there is to know about God. We can't. And we can't make a proper image of him. He says, don't try. He's a jealous God. We read that. He's the only one worthy of worship. He is just. He's righteous. What he does is what is right. Verse 7, he says, you shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain, or you shall not take the name of the Lord your God for useless purpose. For the Lord will not hold him guiltless who takes his name for useless purpose. He has a holy name. It's to be respected. His name stands for him. His name encapsulates all his character. Names work that way for us in this world. When I say a name, you have of someone we both know, you have a picture of that person in your mind. You may see their appearance, but you also see things about their character. If they've done you wrong, you think of them as despicable people. If they've been loving and helpful to you, you have positive things that you think about them, and all you have to do is hear their name to have those type of thoughts. Same thing is true about God. His name is his reputation, and he's jealous for his name. He wants it to be held in honor by all that he has created. It tells us that he's judge. He will not hold him guiltless who takes his name in vain. He's the creator of everything. Come to verse 11. When he says this, for in 6 days the Lord made the heaven and the earth, the sea and all that is in them, and rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day to make it holy. He also is holy. He's our pattern to follow in verse 11. Because he has a Sabbath, we are to have a day of rest, a time where we come apart to focus on who God is, to rest from the normal patterns of our lives. In verses 12 through 17, he gives us a whole series of commandments about how to live with one another as his image bearers in community. And he shows us that he values life and truth and respect for others there. That's what's all involved in honor your father and mother. You shall not murder. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. You shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife or his male servant or his female servant or his ox or his donkey or anything that is your neighbor's. So we learn things about who God is and what's important to him by reading through what he shows us in Exodus 20. When we go to John 1, we find that God reveals himself. Okay, that's repetition from Genesis 1. Because John 1 sounds an awful lot like Genesis 1 when we begin it. It starts with the words in the beginning, just like Genesis 1. And I think that's intentional by John. John wants us to reflect back on Genesis as we begin his gospel, because he wants us to see that as God tells us about creation in Genesis 1, he tells us about the new creation beginning in John 1. It says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. God reveals himself. He is before creation. And he is the creator of everything. All things were made through him, and without him was not anything made that was made. All life comes from him. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. And the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. He's incomprehensible to people without his help. It's basically what he tells us there in verses 5 through 10, that He had to send help through God sent people called prophets and in the New Testament apostles to give us help in understanding who he is. We need special revelation from him so that we can know who he is. He makes people his children. This is a stunning thing to think about. Verse 12. But to all who did receive him, now I'm going to back up to verse 11, excuse me. He, that is Jesus, came to his own people did not receive him. But to all who did receive him, who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God, who were born not of blood, nor of the will of the flesh, nor of the will of man, but of God. He became man. Verse 14 says, the Word, the Son, became flesh and dwelt among us. He took on flesh. He dwelt among people. He walked on this earth. He lived as a Jewish man in a Jewish city at a specific place and time. What we find is that God is Jesus the Christ, who is the Word in the flesh, who shows people the grace, truth, and glory of God. Notice how verses 1 and 2 and 14 and 17 connect together as I read through them. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we have seen his glory, glory as of the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth. For the law was given through Moses. Grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. No one has ever seen God, the only God, who is at the Father's side. He has made him known. The one who was at the side of the Father came and took on flesh and has made God known to us. He's only seen accurately. God is only seen accurate by people in the person of his Son Jesus. There's a passage in Hebrews as it begins that my mind is constantly drawn to when I read through John 1. In Hebrews 1, as he begins, here's what it says about the Son. It talks about revelation as well. It says, long ago, at many times and in many ways, God spoke to our fathers by the prophets. But in these last days, he has spoken to us by his Son, whom he appointed heir of all things, through whom also he created the world. He is the radiance of the glory of God, the exact imprint of his nature. What he's saying there is if we want to see who God is, the person we have to look at is Jesus. He shows us in flesh who God is. The exact imprint of his nature, and he upholds the universe by the word of his power. After making purifications for sin, he sat down at the right hand of the Majesty on high, having become as much superior to the angels as the name he has inherited is more excellent than theirs. An amazing and stunning passage that summarizes what we've seen in Exodus and in John about who God is. In other words, this is where this leads. The ultimate way that one affirms, that one believes that God is the source of all reality is by trusting in his Son. The answer to the question, what is really real, both from the witness of the created order and the revelation of God's word is the same. I am really real. That's what he tells us. I am the source of all that is created. In their book called How Now Shall We Live, Charles Colson and Nancy Pearcey tell how this fundamental truth impacts every other question one has about life. What they say is this: our origin determines our destiny. It tells us who we are, why we are here, how we should order our lives together in society. Our view of origin shapes our understanding of ethics, law, education, and yes, even sexuality. Whether we start with the assumption that we are creatures of a personal God, or that we are products of a mindless process, the whole network of consequences follows, and these consequences diverge dramatically. Before the answers to that question about what is really real, before the answers that people have that are related to that are given, even when given from God's perspective, or before the answers to those questions, even when given from God's perspective, will help people in the decisions that confront them as they live life. They first of all have to have an answer to that question of ultimate reality. God tells people both through the witness of his creation and his word that he's the origin of everything. He has the answer to every problem any person has or could ever face. And we need to remember that. Often we try to solve our own problems without consulting what God tells us, and his answers are there in his word. He's made it possible for us to know him through his son, Jesus Christ. He's made it possible for us to understand who he is through his word. And the ultimate way that one affirms that he believes that God is the source of all reality is by trusting in his son. At the end of his gospel, John reminds those who read that gospel that this is the whole purpose that God has told people, that God has for telling people about himself, about revealing himself. He says this: "Now Jesus did many other things in the presence of the disciples, which are not written in this book, but these are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you have life in his name." God is the one who's really real. He's the one who created everything that is. And he is the one who has sent his son as the new creation, as the new Adam, who went to the cross with an innocent life to lay down, to bear the wrath of God against sin. He's the one who was put in the grave and rose from the grave on the third day in victory over sin and over death and over Satan. He has won the victory, and he calls us to believe. He is the Messiah who was promised in the Old Testament. He is the Son of God, who is there from eternity past and will be there all the way into eternity future. He is the one who will become our judge. He is the one who is our Savior. By believing in him, we have life.